We are on our fourth week of 5 weeks through the book of Ecclesiastes. And if you've been here the last few weeks, you know that I was on vacation, and then we had a guest speaker, and then I was sick. So it's not ideal to take a 3-week break in the middle of a 5-week series, but it's just how it worked out. So think back with me as we start this morning to the start of our series through Ecclesiastes. There's a teacher, often historically held to be Solomon, and his works are collected by an author. We'll finally hear from the author next week in the culmination of our series. And the author talks about this word, hevel, right? The teacher often says hevel. We spent a whole Sunday talking about what it means. Meaningless, fleeting, it's smoke, it's vapor. It means a lot of things, but really it's uncontrollable and confusing. And then we'd spent 2 weeks talking about how life is uncontrollable and confusing, but that doesn't mean that it lacks value. We talked about understanding the finish line of death and understanding that we can't control time moving forward. So this morning we're gonna spend some time in just a small little story in Ecclesiastes 9. I think it's a hidden gem that most of you probably have never read before. Before we get there, as you're turning there, let me tell you 2 stories to start off with. We have a young pastor named Zach. He's coming out of seminary, and as most pastors, he wants to be a great pastor. So he starts asking around, what do you think makes a great pastor? And everyone that he's talking to, they say, well, the great pastors, their churches are big, and they are, a lot of them, professors, and they write books, and they have podcasts and all sorts of things, and they're famous, and they're well known. And so he starts to try to do these things. He wants to get his doctorate so he can teach. He wants to get a book deal. He wants to have a podcast because he wants to be great. He has good intentions in chasing greatness. Let's jump forward 10 years into being a pastor. He gets a phone call. It's the phone call he's been waiting for. On the other end is an executive from a book publisher, and they say, hey, we love your book. We're going to push your book. We're going to put it in every bookstore that we have a connection to. We want to take you on a tour to sign your book. We want you to speak at conferences and at seminaries. And we think this is going to be the next big thing. Congratulations, you've made it. And as soon as he hangs up the phone, Zach finds himself crying. Not tears of joy, not tears of relief, but tears of irony, because he's worked 10 years to achieve greatness in his field, and yet it doesn't feel like he thought it would. You see, Zach, and this is based on the true life of a pastor, finds himself with this phone call, standing in the middle of a grocery store crying in clothes that are not laundered properly, trying to figure out how to put together a menu for the week for him and his 3 daughters, because last month his wife said she didn't love him and she didn't love Jesus anymore, and she left. And he gets up every morning and looks in the mirror, and he's a little bit thinner, and his hairline's a little bit thinner, and he knows it's not for healthy reasons. And he's having a lot of troubles at his church, and he thought that chasing greatness would bring him the things that he wanted, but it wasn't worth the cost. He got the book deal. He got to speak at the conferences. But he chased well-intentioned greatness, and it ended poorly for him. The second story I want to tell you this morning is about a prestigious list, right? We're going to talk about prestige and recognition this morning. Forbes magazine puts out something they call the Forbes 30 under 30 every year for about the last 10, 15 years. And basically, the list is simple. It's 30 people under the age of 30 that they think you should look out for because they're going to be a big deal. They're sports stars and musicians and tech whizzes and young CEOs and entrepreneurs. And it used to be a really big deal to make this list. If you were somebody on the rise in your late 20s, you wanted to make the Forbes 30 for under 30 list. But then a weird thing started to happen. Within the last 5 or 6 years, that list started to become almost something people didn't want to be on. Because every year for the last 6 years, someone on that list has been arrested and put in jail for fraud. Someone on that list got the notoriety by not doing things they ought to have done. And Forbes has really started to take a hit with their reputation. People are saying, like, every year you guys say, watch out for this guy. He's going to be the next big thing. And then it turns out he stole all that money. Look out for this guy. They're going to change the world with their product. Turns out their product was a complete sham and it was a Ponzi scheme. Sometimes notoriety in life is brought on by things that God would not consider to be wise. This morning, as we're in Ecclesiastes 9, we're going to look at kind of the flip side of that, of a story of someone who did what was wise and did not receive recognition. So we'll look at the first 2.5 verses to start off with. I also saw under the sun this example of wisdom that greatly impressed me. There was once a small city with only a few people in it. A powerful king came against it, surrounded it, and built up huge siege works against it. Now there lived in that city a man, poor but wise, and he saved the city by his wisdom. We'll stop there. It's an underdog story. We like underdog stories, right? We like the Cinderella story, the rags to riches story, the David versus Goliath story. And you have to remember that the teacher, who most people hold to be Solomon, is said in this book to be the wisest person in the kingdom. And thinking back on all of the things that he needs to pass on, he says this story impressed him with the wisdom so much that he felt he should pass it on. It's a small city versus a powerful king. The king showed his might by surrounding the city with men and with walls. It says that he used siege works. The way they did this was they would surround the city with men so you couldn't go anywhere. And they would build walls taller than your walls so they could start throwing rocks and spears and arrows and things on fire into your city. They surrounded you so that you knew that resistance was futile. You can surrender now, or you can surrender in a month when you've ran out of food and we've killed half your people. It's a show of force. It's a show of power. However, a poor but wise man saved the city with his wisdom. It's important for us to understand this morning that the teacher wants us to read this as a reality of life. And so he says the man was poor because that's how he'll be remembered. And then secondly, that he was wise. It's also important for us to understand that nowhere in here does it tell us how he did it. What's his plan? There's no model for us to follow, nothing for us to apply, nothing for us to duplicate. All we know is that a poor but wise man did something wise, and it saved the city. And so there may not be a great application point from the man's actions, but we must remember that he saved the city, and that is something to be admired. But some of you probably didn't stop in the middle of the sentence and kept going. You read the back half of that sentence, and it says this, but nobody remembered that poor man. Nobody remembered him. That's how that short story ends. There was a king. He was powerful. He was going to destroy a city. A poor guy who was wise did something wise and saved the city, but no one remembers him. It's a great story, right? It's probably why you guys have not heard it before. It's not articulate. There's not great characters in it. It's not what we expected, right? The hero, his name is not recorded. His plan is not recorded. None of his actions are recorded. And the people whom he saved, they just forgot about him. They moved on with their life. Within a short season of time, they were like, what are you talking about? A king and a wise man. We're just doing life. We only know that he was wise and poor, but wise. And wise in wisdom literature comes back to Proverbs and what we'll talk about again next week. Fear of the Lord is the root of wisdom. Our society really likes biographies, rags to riches stories, movies, books. If you're like me, I love to watch documentaries. It's what I do on my days off. I watch documentaries. We like stories about people that overcome odds, that are successful. But last year I was talking with my buddy who just got done reading a biography about a mogul of some kind. I forget who it was, but guy started from nothing, built a company, had all this money, and the book tried to pass down principles for life to instill to be successful. He was explaining this entire thing to me, and I asked him a question that he's then come back to several times and said he's thought on, and I think maybe we should think on when we talk about things like this. How come we don't write books about poor people? How come we don't write books about unsuccessful people? How come we only write books about the famous and the rich and the ones that are successful? We love those stories, but the hero of our story stayed poor, stayed unremembered, and yet was so remarkable in his wisdom that the wisest man in all of the kingdom says we need to hear the story. It's not the way that it would work out today. I tell you that if it happened today, that man would be on every late night show and he would get a book deal and he would have a movie and his 15 minutes of fame, he would be set and wealthy for the rest of his life. But no one remembered him. In the middle portion of Ecclesiastes, we build up to 9. And he's telling all these things about life. And he gets to this story. And he says, this is his takeaway, right? So the teacher's very good at giving us very plain and simple. This is the takeaway. He says, so I said, wisdom is better than strength. But the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are no longer heeded. Wisdom is better than strength. I think that's one of those sayings that we as Christians say, yes, I agree. But in life, we like to have wisdom, and we like to have a little bit of an ability to show force, to show strength. We'd like to have strength in our back pocket and be wise. But he says, it's wisdom, and it's better than strength. But it's hard to see because the man's wisdom is despised and his words are no longer heeded. Imagine being in a small town and you save the entire town from destruction and they say, thanks, buddy, but we don't need you anymore. His words were no longer heeded. No one listened to him going forward. He was not seen as a wise man past the day. And in fact, his words were despised. If we read between the lines a little bit, we might see someone who says, hey, something bad is happening. Remember when I saved the city? And they said, we're tired of hearing you say things. Despised, not heard. This is the path of wisdom. It doesn't sound as appealing as the path of strength. So in this middle portion between the poems on time and death, we get a discussion on things like wealth, career, status, pleasure, vacations, government, all of these things. And we're going to pull a few kind of just one-liners out of those so we can see that the teacher is building up to this story. And Ecclesiastes 4, he says, better a poor but wise youth than an old foolish king who no longer knows how to heed a warning. So it's better to be young and poor but wise than to be old and foolish but have power. And on the surface, again, we say yes, but none of us have been in a position to turn down a throne anytime lately. If we're offered the seat of power, it's hard for us to say no. And if we were told, hey, you have to go back to your youth and you're going to be flat broke, but you'd be a lot wiser. You can take everything you've learned in life right now, go back to being 12, but you don't have no money. I don't think a lot of us would take that deal. That sounds like a horrible deal. But he's saying this is better. This is better. Wisdom is better than strength. Ecclesiastes 5, 10, and 11 says, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This too is hevel. It's meaningless. As goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit are they to the owner except to feast their eyes on them? I think I've mentioned this before, but when my wife and I were going through premarital counseling, we read a book by Larry Burkett. Larry Burkett was Dave Ramsey before Dave Ramsey was Dave Ramsey. And the whole point of the book, he was talking about this phenomenon that has happened just inside of the lifetime of people in this church. For thousands of years, most families worked off of a single income and then a second spouse that managed the household. Then sometime around the middle of the 1900s, we decided what advantage it would be if both of them worked and both of them got money. And let me stop here. My wife has a job and I support it. And this is not talking about women in the workforce. It's talking about the idea of more and consumption. See, the problem with that is that now fast forward to today's time, and we've built bigger houses and we have multiple cars and multiple TVs. And so We now have families who have two incomes and aren't living as comfortably as families with one income 70 years ago. More doesn't lead to better. When goods increased, there's always someone there to consume them. We've just raised our spending to where we've now met our income. And that was the whole point of the book, was wanting married couples to know that if maybe you remember this transition in your life when you made adult money for the first time, and you're like, I have money. You're looking back, you're like, you did not have money, but you had money compared to what you did before. If we just continue to raise that bar and raise that bar and raise that bar, we want more and we want more and we want more, we'll never find enough. The teacher is looking back at life kind of cynically, but he's saying, like, look, stop just going after all of these things, the strength, the acclaim, the money. They do not satisfy. If we're looking at this section about worldly success and worldly strength, as Christians, we understand what he's saying. The teacher is talking about careers and government and savings accounts and awards and degrees and accomplishments, that they ought not be what we put our hope in, that they ought not be what we pursue primarily, and that makes sense in our head. Then we get to that last line. And yet, their owners feast their eyes upon them. We can see them, and that gives them a distinct advantage, because a lot of the things that we talk about in Christianity require faith, and faith is belief in things unseen. And we are much more comfortable with the things that we can see that are right in front of us. We're much more comfortable with not needing to lean on things unseen. And so, yes, we understand these are not the main priorities, but at some time in our life, we pursue them and we shift around our priorities and we chase acclaim for unacclaim-worthy reasons. Ecclesiastes 9:17, the next verse after that, says, the quiet words of the wise are more to be heeded than the shouts of a ruler of fools. I think everyone in this room knows somebody who is soft-spoken, yet more wise than all of the news talking heads that scream on the television. All of us know somebody who is soft-spoken and wise. And then we also know that we live in a society that thinks that if you yell louder, you win the argument. And so these are good words, but again, we'll head towards where we get caught. Ecclesiastes 7:19 says, wisdom makes one wise person more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. Wisdom makes one person more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. That sounds good to me. I would like that, right? Because he uses that word power. We like that word power. Wisdom makes one wise more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. But the teacher always gives this to us exactly how it is. And so he says, but the poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are no longer heeded. We should heed the words of the wise. Wisdom does, by God's standards, make us more powerful than the leaders of this world, but you need to understand that probably people are going to despise it and not listen to you. There you go. There's the deal. There's how the world really works. Remember, the teacher is looking back kind of as a cynic, saying, hey, if you do everything that you ought to do, it's not always going to work out. So just so we're on the same page, you should seek wisdom, but wisdom might lead to, and is likely to lead to, people despising what you say and not listening to you anymore. It's a hard truth, but it's one that we need to hear to navigate life. He says, wisdom is better than strength. Listen to the wise who are quiet and are of low status. But it's going to be difficult because it's not popular, and also because the things of this world they're right there. They're tangible. We can see them. Which reminds me of another story as we lead towards the one big thing. Borrowed from somebody else's sermon, so they said it was a true story, so we'll go with that. But two explorers are exploring the Rocky Mountains, early 1800s. They want to reach the top of a peak that no one has been to before. One, so they can do it, but two, so they can chart the mountains. And so they're climbing and they're climbing and they're climbing, and this is before harnesses and carabiners and all that stuff. So they're just climbing freehand up this massive rock face. The man gets to 6 feet from the end, He's got both hands on a rock, and he doesn't know where to go next. He can't find a good handhold. He doesn't know where to proceed. He knows that he's got a sturdy base where he is, but he doesn't know where to go from there. Luckily, he was there with a partner, and his partner is up on top of the mountain, and he's looking down over the edge, and he can't quite reach him. He can't see a foothold or handhold from where he sits either. And so the partner is trying to yell down instructions, and finally he has an outside of the box idea. He says, I don't have rope. I can't hold anything down there. So he undoes his belt, then he takes his pants off, and he lays down and he dangles his pants over the edge of the cliff. So the man is hanging on to the side of this cliff, and he has two choices. Hold on to the rock that's in front of him, or reach to the edge of how far he can go and grab onto a pair of pants that's held by a man that he cannot see. I think most of us would be more comfortable saying, I have a rock right here. I'm very comfortable right here. But the man starts to understand also that the rock is fleeting. It's what the teacher might call a hevel. He can't just hang out there for 2 days. His arms will give way and he'll fall. He looks down and he notices that it's a ways down. And so he says a little prayer. He reaches as far as he possibly can, and he grabs a hold of a pant leg held by his friend that he cannot see, and his friend hoists him over the edge. You see, the man made a difficult decision because he came to this realization: you can't cling to both. The teacher wants us to know you can't cling to both. He says one thing about this wisdom that you have to understand. He didn't get a claim. He wasn't the wise man of the village after that. He didn't get money after that. He was despised after that. It may not be great, but wisdom is better than strength. Reaching for that thing that seems unsure by the world's standards, but we hold in faith to be wise, leads us to be able to tell stories about the time when our friend's pant leg helped us over the cliff instead of us falling to our deaths. So our one big thing, if you take nothing else away from our discussion this morning, take away this. Godly wisdom is better than the strength of the world, even if it's despised and not remembered, even when we cannot see why. It's easy to say in a sermon, but it's hard to live out when life gets difficult, when we feel surrounded, when we have a lot, right? It's hard when we have nothing. It's also hard when we have a lot. The rich man went away sad because he had a lot. We don't want to give up the rock that we have a hold of. Godly wisdom is better than the strength of the world, even if it's despised and not remembered, even when we cannot see why. This is not just good wisdom from the Old Testament. This is at the core of our faith as Christians. In Isaiah 53, we get a prophecy about Jesus. And I'm going to jump around a little bit in the chapter, but I'll read some excerpts for you so we can see that wisdom being better than strength is at the core of what we believe. This is about Christ. He says, he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground, he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one of whom the people hid their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. So Scripture makes a few things very clear. Jesus came from humble family, humble background, right? But it also says several times in Scripture that he was not attractive. It's important for us because, we have all sorts of studies in the modern world that says that good-looking people live better lives. We actually had a study that came out last year that said that the average person in the Western world finds a good-looking person to be more trustworthy than a not good-looking stranger. Right? He had nothing about him that would make us come to him. He was a man of suffering. He was a man who was despised, rejected, held of low esteem. And yet he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought all of us peace came from him and was placed upon him. And by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. You know that sheep wander. That's why they have sheepdogs and shepherds with sticks and clubs. Each of us have turned to our own way, our own desires, our own esteem. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of all of us. Christ took on the brokenness, the wanderingness of all of us, even those who are going to and will continue to say no to him and push him away. But after, here's the best part. Here's the part that the world doesn't see, but we get the vision of because of Christ. But after he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out life unto his death. So he's seen as wise but weak, wise but poor by the world standard. A man of suffering, and yet at the end, because he poured out his life unto death, he will divide the spoils with the strong. So what do we do? What do we do with this information? How do we apply it to our lives? The teacher gives us just very straightforward stuff. Remember, wisdom is better than strength. It's hard to apply sometimes. Listen to the people who are giving soft words of wisdom rather than the loud leaders in our society. But I think this morning we need to think on and ponder and pray on letting go of two things. We need to let go of the moment of recognition. It may never come, and even if it does, it is not a guarantee that you're doing it right. We know that awards do not always go to the right people. Recognition does not always go to the right people. Some of the best people that we will ever meet in this life are not famous. They are not award winners. Wisdom is not always remembered, but it's also important for us to remember that Christ understands your frustration. When you feel like you're working and you're working and you're working and you're underappreciated and no one recognizes what you're doing. And you want to just stop doing the good and wise things because no one's recognizing it. So what's the point? He says it's not for the recognition. I died for a world that rejects me. I understand what you're talking about. It's frustrating at times, but we need to let go of doing things for that moment of recognition, that award, that attaboy, that pat on the back. It's not what we're supposed to be going towards. The second thing that we need to pray on and discern our lives to let go of is the sure thing that the world offers. Just because it's easy to see and seems safe doesn't mean it's wise or sustainable. All throughout Ecclesiastes, there's stories of men who got a lot of wealth and acquired much land, much cattle, much esteem. And then they were not allowed to enjoy it, and they died. That's the story over and over and over and over and over again. Just because we have a sure thing doesn't mean that that thing is wise or sustainable. We must pray for discernment. So hear this as we close. If you live a wise, God-fearing life, and when your time has come and you pass away, if your name, your works, and your legacy are all forgotten, you have not lost. By our metrics, you've lost. By the world's standards, you have lost. But all throughout this series, we've been talking about this idea of hevel being smoke, right? Denise saw some smoke come underneath the table before, but this idea of hevel is smoke. It's uncontrollable. It's fleeting. It's hard to grasp. The teacher comes back to this time and time and time again. So many things in life, we can't control it. We really would like to, but we can't. Outcomes, life, death, money. And he says in this passage that wisdom, how it's received, what it's done with it, we can't control. And so one thing that we need to think about is this. Wisdom is like this smoke. By the time we are done singing our last song, there will be no trace in here that I ever put out a plume of smoke. It'll be gone. It'll be dissipated. We'll forgot about it. There won't be a little bit left over. Some of the most wise and God-honoring and God-fearing things that you will ever do will go unrecognized by the world, unrecognized by acclaim, not unrecognized by God, but unrecognized by the world. We just have to be okay with that. We have to know that that doesn't mean that we've lost. It's hard because, again, we would love to live in a world where good people get awards, bad people don't. The right person wins every time. The right person gets the acclaim every time. But the teacher is speaking from a life lived in a world that is broken. The second thing is, if you live a wildly successful life by the world standards, if you win tons of awards and recognitions, if people know you and study you for centuries, you've not won. You're not a winner. What have you gained at the end of it? We started back, 6 weeks ago, asking the question, what have we gained? What is there to gain from life? And the teacher says, that's a bad question to ask. We don't believe, like the Egyptians, that we can pile a bunch of stuff in the grave room with us and take it into the next life. It's not a good question to ask about winning, losing, gaining at the end. Remember only this: Christ is the victor. He has overcome the grave. He will have his day. In light of his glory and his victory, we will not care about the world's perceptions on things like winning and losing and strength and weakness and wisdom and foolishness. We will be with him who has won the victory. So the teacher, who's the most wise man in the kingdom, says you need to remember the story about the guy who we don't know his name and we don't know what he did and everyone forgot about him. That's a memorable story to God. That's a memorable life lived to God. By our standards, that's horrible. By God's standards, it's wise because Christ is the victor. Wisdom is better than strength. Hold the course, beloved of God. Will you pray with me?